Welcome to Healing Heart Stories. My name is Natalie Rivers, 34 years old, and if you think betrayal only comes from strangers, let me show you what it feels like when your own family abandons you at death's door. 2 years ago, I walked into Riverside General Hospital for life-or-death cancer surgery, and not a single member of my family showed up. Not my parents, not my siblings, not even my husband of 8 years. But what the doctor told me after that surgery changed everything, and what happened when they all came crawling back will shock you to your core. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began. It was a Tuesday morning in October when Dr. Harrison called with the results that shattered my world into a million pieces. "Natalie, I need you to come in immediately. The biopsy results show aggressive stage 3 breast cancer. We need to operate within the week." The phone slipped from my trembling hands, clattering against the kitchen floor of our modest home in Willowbrook. Stage 3. Aggressive. Surgery within the week? The words echoed in my head like a death sentence. At 34, I thought I had decades ahead of me. I thought I had time to fix the cracks that had been growing in my relationships, time to bridge the gaps that had formed with my family over the years. I remember sitting on our worn leather couch, staring at the family photos lined up on the mantel. There was my wedding day with David, both of us glowing with hope and promises of in sickness and in health. There were holiday gatherings with my parents, Robert and Linda Hartwell, and my 2 siblings, Rebecca and Thomas. We looked like the perfect family, but appearances can be deceiving. The truth was, I had always been the outsider in my own family. Growing up in the small town of Millbrook, I was the middle child who never quite fit the mold. Rebecca was the golden daughter, beautiful, popular, married to a successful lawyer, living in their dream house on Maple Ridge Drive. Thomas was the cherished son, the football star turned insurance executive who could do no wrong in our parents' eyes. And then there was me, Natalie, the quiet bookworm who became a librarian, who married a mechanic instead of a doctor, who lived in a modest neighborhood instead of the prestigious Oakmont Hills. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. For years, I had felt the subtle but constant message that I wasn't quite enough. Family gatherings were filled with conversations about Rebecca's latest vacation to the Hamptons or Thomas's promotion at Pinnacle Insurance. When it came to my accomplishments, the room would grow quiet, and the subject would quickly change. I had learned to smile and nod, to play the role of the supportive sister and daughter, even as my heart ached for genuine acceptance. But now, facing the fight of my life, surely things would be different. Surely cancer would strip away all the petty jealousies and surface judgments. Surely my family would rally around me when I needed them most. I was so terribly wrong. When I called my parents that evening, my mother's reaction was not the warm embrace of support I desperately needed. "Oh, Natalie," she sighed, her voice heavy with what sounded more like inconvenience than concern. "This is just terrible timing. Your father and I are supposed to leave for that cruise to the Mediterranean next week. We've been planning this for months. Mom, I'm scared." There was a pause that felt like an eternity. "Well, surely David can take care of you. That's what husbands are for, isn't it? Besides, Rebecca is hosting her annual charity gala next weekend, and you know how important that is for her social standing. We can't possibly miss it." The words hit me like physical blows. My mother, the woman who had supposedly loved me unconditionally, was choosing a cruise and a social event over my daughter's cancer surgery? I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest, but I pressed on, hoping against hope. What about Rebecca and Thomas? Maybe they could? Oh, honey, you know how busy Rebecca is with the gala planning, and Thomas has that big presentation at work. I'm sure you understand. We'll visit once you're all recovered and things settle down. The phone conversation ended with empty promises and hollow reassurances, leaving me sitting in my kitchen, tears streaming down my face as the reality sunk in. My own mother had just told me that a vacation and a party were more important than my life-threatening surgery. But surely David would be different. David, who had promised to love me through sickness and health, who had held me through countless smaller crises over our 8 years of marriage. I found him in the garage as usual, tinkering with his motorcycle, grease staining his hands and forearms. "David," I said, my voice still shaky from the phone call with my mother, "I need to talk to you about the surgery." He didn't even look up from his work. "Yeah, about that," he said, adjusting something with his wrench. "I've been thinking, and I don't think I can make it to the hospital. Jimmy offered me overtime at the shop that whole week, and we really need the money. You know how tight things have been." I stared at his back, unable to process what I was hearing. "David, this isn't a routine checkup. This is cancer surgery. There's a chance I might not make it through."
Finally, he turned around, wiping his hands on an old rag, his expression more annoyed than concerned. "Come on, Nat, don't be so dramatic. People have surgery all the time. You'll be fine. Besides, what am I supposed to do? Just sit around a hospital waiting room? That's not going to help anyone." "You're supposed to be there because you love me," I said, the words coming out as barely a whisper. He shrugged, turning back to his motorcycle. "Look, I'll pick you up afterward, okay? But I can't afford to miss a week of work. We've got bills to pay." That night, I lay in our bed listening to David snore peacefully beside me, feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my entire life. The man who had promised to cherish me was treating my cancer surgery like an inconvenient interruption to his work schedule. The family who had raised me was choosing social obligations over their daughter's survival. In desperation, I reached out to Rebecca directly. Surely my sister, despite our complicated relationship, would understand the gravity of the situation. I called her the next morning, catching her at her home in the affluent neighborhood where she lived with her lawyer husband, Preston. "Rebecca, I know Mom told you about the surgery," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh, yes. Such unfortunate timing," she said, and I could hear the clicking of her heels as she paced, probably planning her precious gala. "I really wish I could be there, Natalie, but you know how important this charity event is. We're raising money for the Children's Hospital, and as the chairwoman, I simply cannot abandon my responsibilities. Surely you understand that helping sick children takes priority." The irony wasn't lost on me. My sister was too busy helping sick children to help her own sick sister. "Rebecca, I am sick. I have cancer." "Yes, and I'm very sorry about that, but let's be realistic here. You'll have doctors and nurses taking care of you. What could I possibly do? I'd just be in the way. Besides, Preston says these medical procedures are quite routine nowadays." I tried one last time with Thomas, thinking perhaps my brother might surprise me with genuine concern. But when I reached him at his office at Pinnacle Insurance, his response was equally devastating. "Nat, you know I'd love to be there, but I've got this huge presentation for the Brookfield account. If I land this client, it could mean partner track for me. I'm sure you want me to succeed, right? Besides, Melissa is pregnant again, and she needs me to focus on providing for our growing family." 3 phone calls, 3 rejections. 3 people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had just told me, in various ways, that my cancer surgery was less important than their careers, social events, and vacation plans. The week leading up to the surgery passed in a blur of pre-operative appointments and sleepless nights. I drove myself to every consultation, sat alone in waiting rooms filled with other patients who had loved ones by their sides, and answered the same question over and over. Who will be your emergency contact during the procedure? I don't have one, I would whisper, the shame burning in my chest. The nurses would give me sympathetic looks, assuming I was alone in the world rather than abandoned by the people who were supposed to care most. I couldn't bring myself to explain that I had a husband, parents, and siblings who had simply chosen not to show up for the most terrifying moment of my life. The night before surgery, I sat in my empty house, having packed a small bag with essentials and arranged for a taxi to take me to the hospital in the morning. David had moved to the guest bedroom, claiming he needed good sleep for his big work week. My parents were probably packing for their cruise. Rebecca was likely finalizing seating arrangements for her gala. Thomas was preparing his presentation, and I was preparing to face cancer alone. I remember looking at those family photos one more time, seeing the smiling faces of people who had promised to love me forever. In that moment, something fundamental shifted inside me. The desperate hope I had carried for their support died, replaced by a cold, hard determination to survive, not for them, but in spite of them. As I lay in my bed that final night before surgery, I made myself a promise. If I survived this cancer, if I made it through the surgery and the treatments and the recovery, I would never again beg for love from people who had proven they didn't have any to give. I would never again make myself small to fit into their idea of who I should be. I would never again prioritize their comfort over my own worth. I didn't know it then, but that promise would become the foundation for everything that came after. The surgery would save my life, but that moment of absolute abandonment would save my soul. The morning of October 15th arrived gray and cold, matching the emptiness in my chest. I took a taxi to Riverside General Hospital, clutching my small overnight bag and the folder of insurance paperwork. As we pulled up to the main entrance, I watched other patients being helped out of cars by worried spouses, children, parents. I watched families gather in the lobby, creating circles of support and love around their sick relatives. I walked through those doors, completely alone. The pre-surgery process was a blur of hospital gowns, IV insertions, and final consultations. Every nurse who asked about my family received the same quiet response. They couldn't make it today. I had stopped explaining, stopped making excuses for them, stopped trying to justify their absence to strangers who clearly found it shocking. Dr. Harrison appeared at my bedside just before they wheeled me into the operating room. He was a kind man in his 50s, with gentle eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a reputation for honesty that both comforted and terrified his patients.
Natalie, he said, pulling up a chair beside my bed, I want to talk to you about the surgery one more time. Is your family in the waiting room? I shook my head, unable to trust my voice. He was quiet for a moment, then leaned forward slightly. I want you to know that this surgical team has performed hundreds of these procedures. You're going to be in excellent hands. But I also want you to know that what happens after surgery, the recovery, the treatments, the emotional healing, that's going to require strength you might not know you have. I understand, I whispered. Do you? He asked gently. Because I've seen patients in your situation before, patients who face this fight without the support they deserved. And I want you to know something, Natalie. Sometimes the people who abandon us in our darkest hours do us the greatest favor of all. They show us exactly who we are when we're stripped of everything we thought we needed. I stared at him, not understanding the full meaning of his words, but sensing their importance. You're about to discover something about yourself that many people never learn. You're about to find out just how strong you really are. As they wheeled me toward the operating room, passing the waiting area filled with other families, I caught a glimpse of the clock on the wall. It was 7:30 a.m. At that exact moment, my parents were probably enjoying breakfast on their Mediterranean cruise ship. Rebecca was likely reviewing last-minute details for her charity gala. Thomas was preparing for his important presentation. David was starting his lucrative overtime shift at the garage. And I was going into surgery to fight for my life, completely and utterly alone. But as the anesthesia began to take effect, Dr. Harrison's words echoed in my mind. "You're about to find out just how strong you really are." I didn't know it then, but he was absolutely right. The surgery would remove the cancer from my body, but the abandonment I had experienced would remove something else entirely. My desperate need for approval from people who didn't deserve the privilege of loving me. What happened in that operating room and what Dr. Harrison discovered during the surgery would change everything. But that's where the real story begins. Not with the cancer they cut out of my body, but with the strength they found inside my spirit. The family that abandoned me thought they were writing the end of my story. Instead, they had just written the beginning of my transformation. When I woke up from surgery, the first thing I saw was not a familiar face or a bouquet of flowers. It was the stark white ceiling of the recovery room and the gentle face of Nurse Patricia, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes who had become my unexpected guardian angel. "Welcome back, sweetheart," she whispered, checking my vitals. "Dr. Harrison will be in to see you soon. You did beautifully." As the anesthesia fog cleared, reality crashed back with devastating clarity. The surgery was over, and I was still completely alone. No worried husband pacing the halls, no anxious parents holding vigil, no siblings bringing comfort food or silly magazines to pass the time. Just me, a hospital bed, and the steady beep of monitors tracking my survival. Dr. Harrison appeared within an hour, his expression carefully controlled, but his eyes bright with something I couldn't quite identify. He pulled up the familiar chair beside my bed and opened my chart. "Natalie, I have news about the surgery," he began, his voice measured and professional. "We removed the primary tumor successfully, and I'm happy to report that it hadn't spread as extensively as we initially feared. The lymph nodes we tested came back clean." Relief flooded through me, but he held up a hand indicating there was more. "But here's what I found truly remarkable," he continued, leaning forward slightly. "In my 23 years of practice, I've never seen anything quite like what I observed during your procedure. Your body showed signs of incredible resilience. The way your tissue responded, the blood flow patterns, even your vital signs throughout the surgery. Everything indicated someone with an unusually strong will to live." I stared at him, not understanding where he was going with this. "Natalie, I've performed the surgery on hundreds of patients. Some have entire families filling the waiting room, prayer circles, support systems that would put small armies to shame. Others, like you, face this alone. And I've learned something fascinating over the years. The patients who survive and thrive aren't always the ones with the most support. They're the ones with the strongest internal fire." He closed my chart and looked directly into my eyes. "Your body fought like someone who had something to prove, not to anyone else, but to yourself. That kind of inner strength, it's rarer than you might think." As Dr. Harrison left, his words settled into my consciousness like seeds in fertile soil. For the first time in my life, someone had recognized strength in me that even I didn't know existed. Not the strength to please others or to fit into their expectations, but the strength to survive on my own terms. The next few days in the hospital were a strange mixture of physical pain and emotional awakening. While my body healed from the surgery, my mind began processing the profound abandonment I had experienced. But instead of drowning in self-pity, something unexpected happened. I began to feel grateful. Grateful that David had shown me exactly who he was before I wasted more years pretending he was someone else. Grateful that my parents had revealed their true priorities while I was still young enough to build a different kind of life. Grateful that Rebecca and Thomas had stopped pretending we were close, ending years of awkward family gatherings where I tried desperately to belong. Nurse Patricia became my first real ally in this new chapter. During her shifts, she would sit with me during her breaks, sharing stories about other patients she had seen transform their lives after similar wake-up calls.
"You know what I've learned working here?" she said one evening as she adjusted my IV.
Sometimes the best thing that can happen to a person is to discover who really loves them. And sometimes that list is much shorter than they thought it would be. What if the list is empty? I asked, voicing my deepest fear. She smiled gently. Oh, honey, the list is never empty. It just doesn't always include the people we expected. And sometimes the most important name on that list is your own. When David finally showed up on day 3, not to check on my recovery, but to complain about having to handle household tasks while I was laid up, I saw him with completely new eyes. This man, who I had spent 8 years trying to make proud of me, couldn't even manage basic concern for my well-being. "The kitchen's a mess, Nat," he grumbled, settling into the visitor's chair without asking how I was feeling. "And I couldn't find the checkbook to pay the electric bill. You need to get home soon and get things back to normal." I looked at him, really looked at him, for what felt like the first time. David Thornfield, 36 years old, a man who had promised to cherish me but couldn't even bring me flowers or ask about my prognosis, a man who saw my cancer recovery as an inconvenience to his routine. "David," I said quietly, "do you love me?" He shifted uncomfortably. "What kind of question is that? Of course I do. We're married, aren't we?" "That's not what I asked." The silence stretched between us, filled with 8 years of unspoken truths. Finally, he stood up, clearly agitated by the conversation. "I don't have time for this psychological stuff, Natalie. Just focus on getting better so things can go back to normal." After he left, I realized that normal was exactly what I never wanted to return to. Normal meant accepting scraps of attention from people who saw me as a convenience rather than a person worth loving. Normal meant shrinking myself to fit into spaces where I was barely tolerated. Normal meant dying slowly from emotional starvation while pretending to be grateful for the crumbs. My parents sent a generic get-well card from their cruise, one of those mass-produced things with a generic message about healing thoughts. No personal note, no acknowledgement of the magnitude of what I had just survived. Just their names printed at the bottom like an obligation fulfilled. Rebecca texted me a photo from her charity gala with the caption, "Raised $50,000 for sick children. Wish you could have been here." The irony was so thick, I actually laughed out loud, startling the nurse who was checking my vitals. Thomas sent nothing at all. But here's what I discovered during those long days of recovery. Silence can be a gift. Without the constant noise of trying to please everyone else, I could finally hear my own thoughts clearly. And what I heard was the voice of someone who had been buried under years of people-pleasing and self-doubt. I began making plans. Real plans, not the vague someday dreams I used to whisper to myself when no one was listening. I researched cancer support groups, not because I needed pity, but because I wanted to surround myself with people who understood what it meant to fight for your life. I looked into continuing education programs at Riverside Community College, thinking about that master's degree in library science I had always wanted but never pursued because David said it was too expensive and unnecessary. Most importantly, I began imagining what my life could look like if I stopped trying to earn love from people who had proven they had none to give. The turning point came during my final day in the hospital. Dr. Harrison stopped by for a last checkup, and as he was reviewing my discharge instructions, he paused and looked at me thoughtfully. "Natalie, I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer. What are you going home to?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what kind of environment are you returning to? Supportive? Nurturing? Healing? Or something else?" I was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. "Something else," I finally admitted. He nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "Here's what I want you to remember. You've just survived something that many people don't. Your body has proven it can heal from trauma, but bodies heal in supportive environments much faster than they do in toxic ones." He handed me his card, not just his medical office information, but a handwritten note on the back with the contact information for a social worker who specialized in helping cancer survivors rebuild their lives.
He said, "Sometimes surviving cancer is just the first step. Sometimes the real healing begins when we create lives worth surviving for." When David picked me up from the hospital, I noticed things I had somehow missed for 8 years. How he sighed with annoyance when he had to help me into the car. How he spent the entire drive home complaining about his week rather than asking about my recovery. How he acted like my cancer had been a personal inconvenience to him rather than a life-threatening crisis I had faced alone. Our house felt different when I walked through the door. Not smaller or bigger, just temporary. Like a place I was visiting rather than a home I belonged to. The photos on the mantle, the same ones that I had stared at before my surgery, looked like pictures of strangers now.
I stared at him, realizing that he had no understanding of what I had been through, nor did he care to learn. To him, surgery was surgery, cancer was just another inconvenience, and my recovery was taking too long for his comfort. But instead of the usual pattern of apologizing and trying harder to please him, something new happened. I felt nothing. No anger, no hurt, no desperate need to make him understand. Just a calm, clear recognition that this man was incapable of loving me the way I deserved to be loved. That night, while David snored in the guest bedroom he had claimed during my hospital stay, I made a decision that would change everything. I called the social worker Dr. Harrison had recommended. Her name was Eleanor Santos, and she specialized in helping people rebuild their lives after medical trauma. When I explained my situation, she wasn't shocked or surprised. She had seen it before. Families who abandoned their loved ones during health crises, spouses who treated cancer like a personal betrayal. The thing about major health scares, Eleanor told me during our first phone consultation, is that they strip away all the pretenses. People show you exactly who they are when the stakes are highest. The question isn't why they failed you. The question is, what are you going to do with this information? Over the following weeks, Eleanor helped me develop what she called my recovery plan, not just for my physical healing, but for my emotional and psychological rebuilding. We talked about boundaries, about self-worth, about the difference between being alone and being lonely. "Natalie," she said during one of our sessions, "you've spent your entire adult life trying to earn a place in other people's lives. What would happen if you focused that energy on creating a life so fulfilling that other people would want to earn a place in yours?" The idea was revolutionary to me. Instead of shrinking to fit into other people's expectations, what if I expanded to fill my own potential? I started small. I joined the Cancer Survivor Support Group at Riverside Community Hospital. The first meeting was terrifying. Walking into a room of strangers, admitting that I had survived cancer but lost my family in the process. But within minutes, I realized I wasn't alone in that experience. There was Jennifer, whose adult children had disappeared during her chemotherapy treatments, claiming they couldn't handle seeing her so sick. There was Robert, whose wife had asked for a separation 2 weeks after his prostate cancer diagnosis. There was Maria, whose best friends had slowly stopped calling during her radiation treatments. But there were also the success stories. People who had used their health scares as wake-up calls to leave toxic relationships. People who had discovered inner strength they never knew they possessed. People who had built new, chosen families with fellow survivors who understood what it meant to fight for your life. The funny thing about surviving cancer, Jennifer told the group one evening, is that you realize you can survive anything, including the loss of people who never really loved you in the first place. I began taking evening classes at Riverside Community College, working toward that master's degree I had always wanted. David complained about the time and money it required, but his complaints felt like background noise now. I had discovered something more powerful than his approval, my own ambition. Months passed, and I grew stronger in ways that had nothing to do with my physical recovery. I learned to enjoy my own company, to value my own opinions, to trust my own judgment. I started volunteering at the hospital, helping other patients who were facing surgery alone. I began writing, first in a journal, then in blog posts for other cancer survivors, sharing my story of abandonment and self-discovery. My writing caught the attention of the local newspaper, which ran a feature story about my experience. The article titled, "Finding Strength in Solitude, A Cancer Survivor's Journey," went viral in our small community. Suddenly, people were reaching out. Not my family, but strangers who had similar experiences, who felt seen and understood by my words. The response was overwhelming. Messages from other survivors, from people in toxic relationships, from anyone who had ever felt abandoned by the people they loved most. I realized that my story wasn't unique. It was universal. The details changed, but the pain of abandonment and the power of self-discovery resonated with thousands of people. That's when everything began to shift. Instead of being the library assistant who hid in the background, I became the advocate who spoke up for people facing their darkest moments alone. Instead of being the wife who apologized for taking up space, I became the woman who refused to shrink for anyone's comfort. David noticed the change, of course. As I grew more confident, more independent, more focused on my own goals rather than his comfort, he became increasingly resentful. "You've changed," he complained one evening as I prepared for another support group meeting. "Ever since the surgery, you've become selfish. You never used to put yourself first like this." I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized he was absolutely right. I had changed. I had become someone who valued herself enough to pursue her dreams, to set boundaries, to expect basic human decency from the people in her life. "You're right," I said calmly. "I have changed. I've become someone who believes she deserves to be loved properly." His face darkened. "And I suppose I don't love you properly?" "David," I said gently, "you didn't even show up for my cancer surgery. What do you think?" The fight that followed was inevitable, but it wasn't the screaming match I might have expected. It was more like a calm recognition of facts. David accused me of holding grudges, of being ungrateful for his support, of becoming too independent for marriage. I listened to his complaints and realized that every single one of them was actually a compliment in disguise.
Too independent? Good. I had learned to rely on myself. Holding grudges? No, I was holding standards. Ungrateful for his support? What support? The man hadn't even visited me in the hospital. As my one-year cancerversary approached, the anniversary of my diagnosis, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. I planned a celebration, not a somber remembrance of trauma, but a genuine celebration of survival, transformation, and new beginnings. I invited everyone who had supported me during my recovery, my support group friends, Eleanor, the social worker, Dr. Harrison and Nurse Patricia, my new classmates from graduate school, the volunteers I worked with at the hospital, people who had chosen to love me, not because they were obligated to, but because they valued who I was becoming. I didn't invite my family. I didn't invite David. The celebration was held at the community center, a small gathering of people who understood that surviving cancer was about more than just beating a disease. It was about beating the parts of yourself that accepted less than you deserved. Dr. Harrison gave a short speech about the medical miracle of survival, but he ended with something more personal. "Natalie, a year ago, you asked me if you were strong enough to survive the surgery. Tonight, I can say with certainty that you weren't just strong enough to survive cancer, you were strong enough to thrive in spite of everyone who told you that you couldn't." As I looked around the room at these people who had chosen to celebrate my life rather than tolerate my existence, I realized that my family had given me the greatest gift they possibly could have. They had abandoned me so completely that I had no choice but to discover who I really was. The woman they had left behind was gone forever. In her place stood someone they wouldn't even recognize, someone who knew her own worth, who surrounded herself with genuine love, who had built a life so fulfilling that their absence felt like freedom rather than loss. But I had no idea that this transformation was about to be tested in the most unexpected way, because just as I was settling into my new life, just as I was finally at peace with their absence, they were about to come back,
And when they did, they would discover that the woman they had abandoned no longer existed. In her place was someone who knew exactly what she was worth and exactly what they weren't. The phone call came on a rainy Thursday evening in March, exactly 18 months after my surgery. I was grading papers for the literacy program I had started at Riverside Community Center when an unknown number flashed across my screen. Something made me answer it, perhaps the same intuition that had carried me through my darkest days. "Natalie? Thank God I finally reached you." The voice was my mother's, but it sounded hollow, desperate in a way I had never heard before. "We need to talk. It's urgent." I set down my pen slowly, my heart rate remaining surprisingly steady. 18 months of therapy and self-discovery had taught me to recognize manipulation tactics, and the urgency in her voice triggered every alarm bell I had learned to heed. "Hello, Linda," I said, deliberately using her first name instead of Mom, a boundary I had established with Eleanor's help. "This is unexpected." "Linda, Natalie, I'm your mother. We need to meet. There have been some developments, family developments. We're at the Riverside Diner on Elm Street. Can you come right now?" The audacity was breathtaking. After 18 months of complete silence, after abandoning me during cancer surgery, she was calling and expecting me to drop everything and rush to meet them. The old Natalie would have been there in 10 minutes, apologizing for taking so long. "No," I said simply. The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, she spoke again, her voice shaking with what sounded like genuine panic. "Natalie, you don't understand. Your father is sick, very sick, and there are other problems, financial problems. We need you." Those 3 words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. For years, I had lived to hear those words from my family. I had dreamed of being needed, of being essential, of finally mattering enough for them to reach out. Now that they were here, they felt empty, manipulative, like a tool being used to pry open a door I had deliberately sealed shut. "I'm sorry to hear about Robert's health," I said, maintaining the emotional distance that had become my armor. "You should contact his doctor for medical advice." "Natalie, please! We're your family. We know we haven't been in touch, but—" "You didn't abandon just touch," I interrupted, my voice remaining calm but firm. "You abandoned me during cancer surgery. There's a difference." Another long pause. Then I heard whispering in the background, urgent and heated. Someone was coaching her, telling her what to say. "We're sorry about that. We truly are. But we're here now and we need to see you. Rebecca is here too. And Thomas, we're all here waiting for you." The mental image was almost laughable. The entire Hartwell family assembled at the local diner like they were planning a surprise birthday party instead of staging an intervention designed to extract something from me. Their timing wasn't coincidental. They had clearly researched my life, knew about my recovery, my success, my transformation. "What do you need?" I asked directly, cutting through the emotional manipulation. More whispering, then my mother's voice again, shakier now. "Your father needs surgery. Heart surgery, and the insurance, there are complications with the insurance. We thought maybe, since you work at the hospital now and you understand these things." There it was. They hadn't come back out of love, guilt, or even basic human decency. They had come back because they needed something from me. My connections, my knowledge, my resources. The family that had deemed me worthless when I was vulnerable was now seeking my help, now that they were the vulnerable ones.
"I see," I said, and in that moment, I truly did see everything with perfect clarity. "And you thought 18 months of silence could be erased with one phone call because you need a favor? It's not a favor," my mother snapped, her desperation finally breaking through the artificial sweetness. "He's your father! Family helps family!" The hypocrisy was so complete, so utterly shameless, that I found myself genuinely impressed by their audacity.
Family helps family, unless that family member has cancer and needs emotional support during surgery, unless that family member's crisis interferes with vacation plans and social events. You're right, I said softly. Family does help family, which is why your abandonment taught me exactly who my real family is. I heard my father's voice in the background, weak and strained. Let me talk to her. The phone was passed, and Robert's voice came through, gravelly and tired in a way that might have moved me 18 months earlier. Natalie, sweetheart, I know we made mistakes, but I'm scared. The doctors say this surgery is risky, and I need my daughter. The words that should have melted my heart felt like manipulation tactics now. I had needed my parents during my surgery too, but my fear and vulnerability had been dismissed as dramatic, inconvenient, poorly timed. Robert, I said gently, you have 3 children. Perhaps you should call one of them. You are one of them, he said, confusion evident in his voice. Am I? Because when I needed you most, you made it very clear that I wasn't worth your time or attention. You chose a cruise over your daughter's cancer surgery. You chose social events over my survival. So forgive me if I'm confused about my status in this family. Natalie, that was different. You were going to be fine. The doctor said the surgery was routine. Even now, even while begging for my help, he was diminishing my experience, minimizing my trauma, rewriting history to make his abandonment seem reasonable. The pattern was so familiar, so deeply embedded in their behavior, that I found myself genuinely impressed by their audacity. Dad, I said, using the term deliberately to show I understood the relationship he claimed we had, my surgery wasn't routine. I had aggressive stage 3 cancer. I could have died. And you chose not to be there because it was inconvenient? But you didn't die, he said, as if that justified everything. You're fine now. You're successful. You're strong. You proved you didn't need us. There it was, the final, devastating revelation. In his mind, my survival without their support proved that I hadn't deserved their support in the first place. My strength in the face of their abandonment became retroactive justification for their abandonment. You're absolutely right, I said, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over me. I proved I didn't need you. And I still don't. The phone was snatched away, and suddenly Rebecca's voice was on the line, sharp with the same entitlement that had defined her entire life. Natalie, stop being dramatic. Dad could die without this surgery, and you're sitting there playing victim over something that happened almost 2 years ago? We all have problems. We all have struggles. It's time to grow up and help your family. The casual dismissal of my cancer as something that happened almost 2 years ago was perfectly Rebecca that I almost smiled. In her world, other people's trauma existed only as inconveniences to her comfort, and recovery was just another form of selfishness that needed to be corrected. Rebecca, I said calmly, where were you when I was facing surgery? I was raising money for sick children. I was doing something meaningful with my life instead of wallowing in self-pity. You were hosting a party, I corrected. A party you deemed more important than your sister's cancer surgery? It wasn't just a party. It was a charity gala that raised $50,000 for the children's hospital. I helped dozens of sick kids while you had one little surgery. One little surgery. My life-threatening cancer surgery was one little surgery in her mind, less important than her social event, less deserving of attention than her charity photo opportunities. And now you want me to help your father get his one little surgery? I observed. Interesting how family obligations work in your world, Rebecca. The phone was grabbed again, and Thomas's voice came through, attempting his old role as the family mediator, but with an edge of desperation I had never heard before. Nat, look, We all could have handled things better back then, but we're here now, and we're trying to make things right. Dad's really sick, and we're scared. Can't we just put the past behind us and move forward as a family? Put the past behind us, the universal battle cry of people who had caused harm and wanted to escape the consequences. But putting the past behind us would require acknowledging what actually happened, taking responsibility for their choices, and making genuine amends. Instead, they wanted me to pretend their abandonment had never occurred so they could access my resources guilt-free. "Thomas," I said, "what exactly do you need from me?" His relief at my seemingly practical question was audible. "Well, you work at the hospital now, right? And you understand insurance and medical systems. Dad's surgery is going to cost about $200,000, and his insurance is only covering 60%. We thought maybe you could help navigate the system, maybe use your connections to get better coverage or payment plans, maybe—" He trailed off, but I could fill in the blanks. They wanted me to leverage my relationships with Dr. Harrison and the medical staff to get special treatment for the father who had abandoned me. They wanted me to use the connections I had built while recovering from the trauma they had caused to help them avoid the consequences of their own poor planning.
I see, I said. And what are Rebecca and you contributing to this solution? Silence. Then Thomas cleared his throat uncomfortably. Well, Rebecca's going through a divorce right now, so her finances are complicated. And Melissa and I just bought the new house in Oakmont Hills, so we're a bit stretched thin. Of course they were. The Golden children had made typical golden child decisions: expensive houses, lavish lifestyles, financial choices that looked good on social media but left no room for emergencies. And naturally, they expected the family scapegoat to solve the problem they couldn't. So let me understand this correctly, I said, maintaining my calm tone. You want me to use my relationships and expertise to help the father who abandoned me during cancer surgery, while his other children, who were too busy for my crisis, are too financially strapped from their lifestyle choices to help with his? When you put it like that, it sounds accurate, I suggested. The phone was passed back to my mother, whose voice had devolved into barely controlled hysteria. Natalie, I don't understand what's happened to you. You used to be such a caring person. You used to put family first. This cold, selfish woman isn't the daughter I raised. Her words might have devastated me 18 months earlier. Now they felt like a confirmation of every insight I had gained in therapy. The daughter she had raised was someone who put everyone else's needs before her own, who accepted scraps of affection as sufficient love, who apologized for existing, and grateful for basic human decency. That daughter had nearly died, not from cancer, but from starvation of the soul. You're right, I said. The daughter you raised would have already been at that diner apologizing for making you wait and promising to fix everything. She would have emptied her savings account and sacrificed her future to prove she was worthy of your love. She would have been grateful that you even called. Yes, my mother said, hope creeping into her voice. Yes, exactly. That's the Natalie we know and love. That Natalie is gone, I said simply. She died during surgery 18 months ago, not from cancer, but from finally understanding that she had been loving people who were incapable of loving her back. The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, my mother spoke again, her voice shaking with rage and desperation. Fine. If that's how you want to be, we'll figure this out ourselves. But don't come crawling back to us when you realize what you've lost. Don't expect us to welcome you with open arms when you're old and alone and have no one. The threat was so perfectly typical, so utterly predictable that I almost laughed. They were threatening to withdraw the love they had already proven they didn't possess, promising to abandon the daughter they had already abandoned. Linda, I said gently, I'm not alone. I'm surrounded by people who chose to love me, not people who are obliged to tolerate me. I'm surrounded by people who showed up when I needed them, not people who show up when they need something from me. Those people aren't family, she spat. No, I agreed. They're better. They're family I chose and who chose me back. I heard movement in the background, urgent whispers, and then Rebecca's voice again, sharper and more vicious than before. Fine, Natalie. Be selfish. But remember this when Dad dies on that operating table. Remember that you could have helped but chose to hold grudges instead. His death will be on your conscience, not ours. The manipulation was so blatant, so desperately cruel, that it actually impressed me with its shamelessness. They were trying to make me responsible for their father's health crisis, just like they had tried to make me responsible for their emotional comfort my entire life. Rebecca, I said calmly, if Robert dies, it won't be because I failed to fix your family's problems. It will be because life is unpredictable and hearts sometimes fail. But if he survives, and I hope he does, it will be because medical professionals did their jobs, not because his daughter sacrificed herself to earn your approval. You're heartless, she whispered. No, I said. I finally have a heart healthy enough to refuse to be broken by people who never valued it in the first place. The call ended abruptly, leaving me sitting in my quiet apartment, surrounded by the life I had built from the ashes of their abandonment. My hands weren't shaking, my heart wasn't racing, I felt no guilt, no regret, no desperate urge to call them back and apologize. I felt free. Over the following days, they tried various tactics to reach me. Text messages ranged from pleading to threatening to manipulative. Rebecca sent photos of our father in the hospital, looking frail and frightened, with messages like, "Look what your selfishness is doing to him." Thomas tried the reasonable approach, suggesting we meet for coffee to talk things through like adults. My mother alternated between guilt trips and rage, sometimes within the same message. I saved every communication, not out of sentimentality, but because Eleanor had taught me the importance of documentation when dealing with manipulative people. Each message served as a reminder of exactly why I had been right to cut them out of my life. The breakthrough came when David, who I was still technically married to but living separately from, showed up at my apartment with information he clearly thought would change everything. "Nat, I just heard about your dad from Rebecca," he said, pushing his way into my living space uninvited. "She called me crying, telling me how you're refusing to help with his surgery. What the hell is wrong with you?" I looked at my husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, and realized that he had always been the perfect match for my family. He understood their language of emotional manipulation, shared their belief that my purpose was to serve their needs, and felt entitled to my resources whenever it was convenient.
David, we're separated. My family relationships are no longer your concern. We're not divorced, he said, as if our legal status gave him authority over my decisions. And I can't believe you're being this petty. The man is dying. The man abandoned his daughter during cancer surgery, I replied, and now he needs help from medical professionals, not from the daughter he deemed unworthy of his time. You're not going to help at all? David asked, incredulous. Not even going to visit him? I'm not preventing him from getting medical care, I said. I'm simply not providing it myself. There's a difference. David stared at me like I had become a stranger, and I realized that he was right. I had. The woman he had married was someone who would have bankrupted herself to prove her worth to people who had already demonstrated her worthlessness to them. Rebecca said, "You've been brainwashed by those therapy people," he said, his voice taking on the same entitled edge I remembered from my family. "She said you've turned into some kind of selfish feminist who thinks she's too good for her own family." The phrase selfish feminist was so perfectly ridiculous, such a transparent attempt to shame me back into compliance, that I actually smiled. "David, do you know what I've learned in therapy?" I asked. "I've learned that when people call you selfish for having boundaries, they're really upset that they can no longer use you selflessly." His face darkened. "So you're just going to let your father die to prove some point?" "I'm going to let medical professionals handle his medical crisis, while I continue living the healthy, fulfilling life I've built. His survival doesn't depend on my participation, despite what my family might believe." David left in frustration, but not before making it clear that my family had enlisted him in their campaign to break down my boundaries.
Over the following week, he returned several times with updates about my father's condition, messages from my family, and increasingly desperate attempts to guilt me into compliance. But I had learned something powerful during my own medical crisis. Other people's emergencies don't automatically become your obligations, especially when those people had proven that your emergencies weren't their obligations. The final confrontation came when they showed up at my apartment unannounced. I was returning from an evening class when I found them clustered around my door like storm clouds. My parents, both siblings, and David, all wearing expressions of grim determination. My father looked genuinely ill, leaning heavily on a walker and breathing with obvious difficulty. My mother appeared haggard and desperate. Rebecca and Thomas flanked them like bodyguards, ready to launch their coordinated attack. "Natalie," my father wheezed as I approached, "I'm asking you as your father, don't let me die because you're angry with us." The manipulation was masterful, framing my boundaries as a death sentence I was imposing, rather than a healthy response to their historical behavior. But 18 months of growth had inoculated me against this particular poison. "Robert," I said gently, pulling out my keys, "I'm not killing you. Your heart condition is killing you. Those are two very different things." "You could help us navigate the medical system," my mother pleaded. "You could use your connections. You could make this easier." "I could," I agreed, "but I won't, because the daughter who would have done that was abandoned by her family 18 months ago." Rebecca stepped forward, her face twisted with the same rage I had seen during countless childhood arguments where she didn't get her way. "You selfish bitch! You're going to watch our father die because you're still pouting about ancient history?" The words that would have destroyed me 18 months ago bounced off me like rain off glass. Ancient history. That's what my cancer had become in their minds. Ancient history that didn't warrant acknowledgement, apology, or change in behavior. "Rebecca," I said calmly, "if you can afford a divorce attorney, you can afford to contribute to Dad's medical bills. If Thomas can afford a house in Oakmont Hills, he can afford to help his father. If you all can afford to coordinate family interventions, you can afford to coordinate family financial solutions." Thomas tried his reasonable voice again. "Nat, we're not asking you to pay for everything. We're asking you to help us navigate the system, use your knowledge and connections to make this easier." "And I'm declining," I said simply. "I'm choosing not to use the relationships I built while recovering from the trauma you caused to solve problems you created through your own choices." My mother broke down completely then, sobbing in a way that was clearly designed to break my resolve. "Natalie, please, I'm begging you, help us save your father." I looked at this woman who had given birth to me but had never really mothered me, who had taught me that love was conditional on convenience, who had abandoned me during my darkest hour and now expected salvation during hers. "Linda," I said gently, but firmly, "you taught me something valuable 18 months ago. You taught me that when people need help, the family members who truly love them show up. The family members who don't love them make excuses." I unlocked my door and stepped inside, turning back to face them one final time. "You're welcome to make excuses, but I'm done showing up for people who wouldn't show up for me." As I closed the door, I could hear my mother's sobs turn to rage, Rebecca's curses, Thomas's threats about what this would mean for any future relationship. David was shouting something about legal action and marital obligations. But inside my quiet apartment, surrounded by photos of my chosen family, my certificates from graduate school, my awards for volunteer work, I felt nothing but peace. The storm outside my door was not my storm to weather. The crisis beyond my threshold was not my crisis to solve. For the first time in my life, I was home. 3 weeks after the confrontation at my doorstep, I received news that would test everything I had learned about boundaries, forgiveness, and the true meaning of family. Dr. Harrison called me on a Saturday morning, his voice carrying the weight of difficult information. "No," I said, "but I'm grateful that he's going to be okay. Natalie, I want you to know that I think you've handled this entire situation with remarkable wisdom. I've seen too many patients sacrifice their own healing to manage other people's crises." Over the following months, the family drama gradually faded into background noise. My relatives stopped calling. My siblings stopped showing up uninvited. David finally moved out of our shared spaces completely and hired a lawyer to begin divorce proceedings. But something unexpected happened during this period of quiet. I began receiving messages from strangers, people who had heard about my situation through the hospital network, through mutual friends, through the invisible network of people seeking permission to prioritize their own well-being. The messages followed a similar pattern. "I heard about how you handled your family situation during your father's illness. I'm facing something similar and I don't know what to do." A woman whose alcoholic mother demanded she drop everything to manage her repeated relapses. A man whose abusive brother expected forgiveness every time he got arrested. A young woman whose family had ostracized her for being gay, but now wanted her financial help during an economic crisis. Each story was different in its details, but identical in its core. People who had been trained to sacrifice their well-being for the comfort of people who had proven themselves unworthy of that sacrifice. I began meeting with these individuals informally, sharing what I had learned about boundaries, about chosen family, about the difference between loving people and enabling their dysfunction. What started as occasional coffee meetings evolved into regular support groups, which eventually became workshops I facilitated through the community center. The program I developed was called Healing from Family Trauma, and it filled up immediately every time I offered it. Apparently, there were thousands of people walking around with wounds inflicted by the people who were supposed to love them most, people who had been taught that forgiveness meant accepting continued abuse, that family loyalty meant sacrificing your own peace for other people's comfort. Dr. Harrison attended one of my first workshops, not as a participant, but as a medical professional interested in understanding the psychological components of healing. "You know," he told me afterward, "what you're doing here is as important as any medical treatment I provide. You're teaching people that they have the right to heal, even if that healing requires them to step away from the people who wounded them." The program grew. I was invited to speak at other hospitals, at community centers throughout the region, at conferences for social workers and therapists. My story, the story of the woman who survived cancer only to discover that the real disease was her toxic family relationships, resonated with audiences everywhere. I published an article in a professional journal about family abandonment during medical crises. The response was overwhelming. Healthcare workers from around the country reached out to share similar stories, to ask for guidance in supporting patients whose families failed them during their most vulnerable moments. A year after my father's crisis, I received an invitation that initially surprised me. The state medical board asked me to serve on a committee developing protocols for supporting patients who lack family support during medical emergencies. My experience, both as a patient abandoned by family and as an advocate for others in similar situations, had given me expertise that traditional medical training couldn't provide. The work was deeply fulfilling in ways I hadn't expected. Instead of trying to earn love from people who had proven incapable of giving it, I was using my experience to create systematic change for people facing similar struggles. Instead of begging for a place in my biological family, I was building a professional family of colleagues who valued my insights and contributions. On the second anniversary of my father's surgery and my refusal to participate in it, I received a card in the mail. The return address was unfamiliar, but the handwriting inside was shaky and uncertain. "Dear Natalie, I don't expect you to respond to this. I don't deserve a response,
But I wanted you to know that I've been going to therapy since my heart surgery, trying to understand how I became the kind of father who would abandon his daughter during cancer. My therapist says I need to take responsibility for my choices without expecting forgiveness in return. So this isn't a request for reconciliation, it's an acknowledgement that I failed you when you needed me most, and that failure was entirely my own. You deserved better from me. You deserved better from all of us. I'm proud of the woman you've become, and I'm sorry it happened in spite of our family rather than because of it. Love, Dad. I read the letter 3 times, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Sadness for the relationship we could have had, validation for the pain I had endured, respect for the self-reflection he was apparently doing, but no regret for the boundaries I had maintained for very good reasons. I showed the letter to Eleanor during our monthly check-in session. We had transitioned from therapy to friendship, but she remained my trusted advisor for navigating complex emotional terrain. "How does it feel to receive that acknowledgement?" she asked. "Peaceful," I said, surprising myself. Like the end of a very long, very sad story. "Are you tempted to respond? To try rebuilding that relationship?" I considered the question seriously. No, I appreciate the acknowledgement, but acknowledgement doesn't erase history, and I don't need his approval or reconciliation to validate my choices. I already know I made the right decisions. "You sound different when you talk about him now. Less angry, but also less invested."
She was right. The burning rage I had carried for so long had cooled into something more like philosophical disappointment. I felt sad that my father was the kind of person who could abandon his child during a medical crisis, the same way I might feel sad about any stranger's character flaws. But his failures no longer felt personal because I no longer needed his approval to define my worth. That evening, I attended the weekly support group I had been facilitating for over a year. The faces changed regularly, but the stories remained heartbreakingly similar. Tonight's group included Maria, whose family had stopped visiting during her chemotherapy because her treatments were too depressing. There was James, whose parents had refused to help with his medical bills while simultaneously funding his brother's 3rd wedding, and Sarah, whose siblings had disappeared during her mental health crisis, only to resurface when they needed her expertise for their own problems. As we went around the circle sharing updates and insights, I realized that this room contained more genuine family than I had ever experienced in my biological relationships. These people showed up for each other consistently. They celebrated each other's victories and provided comfort during setbacks. They had chosen each other deliberately, carefully, with full knowledge of each other's struggles and commitment to each other's healing. "I want to share something with all of you," I said as our session was winding down. 2 years ago, I thought family was something that happened to you, a lottery you were stuck with regardless of how those people treated you. I thought love meant accepting whatever scraps of affection people were willing to offer and being grateful for anything that resembled care. The room was quiet, attention focused completely on my words. I've learned that real family is something you create. Real love is something you choose and keep choosing. And real belonging happens when people see who you really are and decide they want you in their lives anyway. I looked around the room at these incredible people who had survived abandonment, betrayal, and emotional abuse from the people who were supposed to love them most. People who had learned to value themselves enough to demand better. People who had chosen healing over habit, boundaries over biology, chosen family over obligated tolerance. Everyone in this room is proof that you can survive the loss of people who never really loved you properly. You can build lives so fulfilling that their absence becomes a gift rather than a punishment. You can become so whole that you stop needing broken people to complete you. As we closed the session and people began gathering their things, Maria approached me with tears in her eyes. "Natalie, I want you to know that this group, the work you do, It saved my life. Not from cancer, from something worse. It saved me from believing I had to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it. Her words echoed something Dr. Harrison had told me 3 years earlier. Sometimes surviving the crisis is just the beginning. Sometimes the real healing starts when you create a life worth surviving for. As I drove home that night, I thought about the woman I had been before cancer, before abandonment, before the painful awakening that had ultimately set me free. That woman had been so focused on earning love that she had forgotten to give it to herself. She had been so afraid of being alone that she had surrounded herself with people who made her feel lonely. The woman driving home now understood that solitude and loneliness were completely different experiences. Solitude was peaceful, chosen, empowering. Loneliness was what happened when you were surrounded by people who couldn't really see you. I was rarely alone anymore. My chosen family included colleagues, friends from support groups, fellow advocates, and the growing community of people committed to healing from family trauma. But even when I was by myself, I no longer felt lonely. I had learned to enjoy my own company, to value my own opinions, to trust my own judgment. The apartment I came home to each night was filled with evidence of a life lived on my own terms. Awards for my advocacy work, photos with chosen family, books I had written and articles I had published, certificates from continuing education programs I had completed. Not because anyone expected it, but because learning brought me joy. Most importantly, it was filled with peace. The kind of deep, settled peace that comes from knowing you've chosen your own well-being over other people's comfort, your own truth over their convenience, your own healing over their dysfunction. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about the young woman who had walked into surgery 3 years earlier, abandoned and alone, terrified that she might die unloved. She had died that day, but not from cancer. She had died from finally understanding that the love she had been desperately seeking from her family had never existed in the first place. In her place had risen a woman who knew that love, real love, was not something you earned through sacrifice and self-denial. Real love was something you cultivated through authenticity, boundaries, and the courage to choose people who chose you back. The family that abandoned me during my darkest hour had given me the greatest gift possible, the opportunity to discover who I really was when I stopped trying to be who they wanted me to be. Their rejection had forced me to build a life so genuine, so fulfilling, so aligned with my actual values that their absence felt like freedom rather than loss. I was no longer the daughter desperately seeking approval from people incapable of giving it. I was no longer the wife sacrificing her dreams for a husband's comfort. I was no longer the sister trying to earn a place at a table where she wasn't welcome. I was Natalie Rivers, survivor, advocate, teacher, chosen daughter of people who had earned that privilege through love rather than biology. I was living proof that you could lose everything you thought you needed and discover that what you actually needed was the courage to build something better. And as I drifted off to sleep in my peaceful home, surrounded by evidence of a life lived authentically, I felt nothing but gratitude, not for the family that had abandoned me, but for the strength I had found when they did. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.